I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you.
Welcome to episode 82. Can you believe that?
Was a good year.
Yeah, it was.
I graduated that year.
1882?
Yeah.
We will have an update from an old friend today, Desmond Ryan. But first, we're going to have an interview with the author, Lauren North.
Lauren North studied psychology before moving to London, where she lived and worked for many years. She now lives with her family in the Suffolk countryside. The Perfect Son is her first novel. She's working on her second.
We will be discussing her debut book, The Perfect Son. When Tess Clark wakes up in the hospital the day after her son Jamie's 8th birthday, she's sure of these things. She's been stabbed, her son is missing, her brother-in-law and her grief counselor are involved, but no one is listening to her. After her husband Mark died suddenly in a terrible accident a few months earlier, the only thing keeping Tess together is Jamie. As they struggle to make sense of their new life without Mark, they find joy in brief moments of normalcy, like walking to school and watching television together. Life is hard without Mark. Tess has Jamie, and that's what matters. But there in the hospital, confused and surrounded by people who won't listen, Tess's world is falling apart. To save her son, she must piece together what happened between Mark's death and Jamie's birthday, but the truth might just be too much for her to bear.
We would like to welcome to the program Lauren North. Welcome, Lauren.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
Tessa's story is really such a heart-wrenching story of grief.
Yes.
Yeah, we hope this is not based on something from your personal life. Where did Tessa's story come from?
No, luckily not. Well, I think all authors draw on some experience from themselves. There were some similarities between myself and Tess in that I used to live in a very busy town and had lots of friends and a very big network. And then we moved to a very small village and I didn't know anyone. And I felt very incredibly isolated. It occurred to me then that if the worst should happen and I was on my own, I don't know how I'd cope. That planted a seed that became Tess's story. So I went through some isolation similar to what she went through, but that's where the similarities end, thankfully.
Well, the isolation definitely played a very big part in the story.
Yeah, absolutely. It's set actually in the village where I live, so it felt very real for me to set it here and to draw on my own experiences of just not knowing anybody, not really knowing where anything was, just having no one to turn to.
I do feel like I need to give our listeners a little disclosure here. This book is amazing. There's going to be a lot of things in it that we really can't go too deep into because it will give some things away.
Yes, sorry.
Now, Tess is a very sad character. She really was dealing with some tragedy. How would you diagnose her?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think that I would go with just such a raw grief that really pushes her into a very dark place and into the depression which she experiences. And everything that happens to her sort of really unfolds from that darkness, I would say.
You have a psychology back, am I mistaken?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I do.
And are there instances where grief would devolve into other types of psychosis?
Yeah, absolutely. It can happen. I think if you're pushed and pushed and pushed to a point where you don't feel like you can cope on your own anymore, then anything can happen. And I think that there are certain people who are perhaps more vulnerable to mental illnesses. In the book, I did try and play on the fact that Tess had in the past experienced quite a lot of anxiety. And I think that that really comes forward and becomes part of her mental problems as the book develops.
Well, moving a little bit sideways to Shelley, she did things that no normal grief counselor would do. Was her character based on a real protocol for a grief counselor?
I think the first meeting was, as you'd expect from a grief counsellor, to have someone come and just listen to you and be there for you, and not to tell you that you're going to be fine and that, you know, to carry on. That's not what you need to hear, I think, in these situations. So the first time they meet, she does carry on as you would expect from a grief counsellor, I believe. I tried to make it so that she really then began to feel like Tess was her friend rather than her patient, if you like. And so the things that she did afterwards became more about her friendship with Tess rather than anything that a grief counsellor would do, because, as you say, she very much crosses the line in that respect.
Yes, she did. And speaking of characters like Shelley, there were other characters in the book, like Ian, her brother-in-law.
And... Oh, I just didn't like him.
You did a good job of creating somebody that you don't like.
Yeah.
And Richard Welkin and another cast of characters. Do you feel that when somebody dies, especially as tragically as her husband did, that there are people that react or take advantage of the situation?
I would hope not. I think that when you are grieving and when you are in a very vulnerable position, you do open yourself up to horrible people, I suppose. I don't think people go out their way to manipulate grieving people, but I certainly think that they are a very vulnerable group, and that if you are experiencing that horrible, horrible raw grief, then you do feel very much very vulnerable. And I think from Tess's perspective, it was a double whammy for her, because she had these people in her life that she didn't know she could trust, but she also went quite great lengths to isolate herself further from her mother and her brother and her friends that weren't that local anymore, but that were still trying to get in touch with her. So I think that she really made herself more vulnerable in that situation.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because that was a good point about her reaction, because you kind of felt like some of these people were there for her. They couldn't break through the barrier of her grief.
No, absolutely. I certainly felt that she shut them out and she allowed herself to be really alone in that house. And that was really to try and protect herself and Jamie. I think when you've read the ending and you look back, I think you can see why she wanted to isolate herself from people who knew her before Mark passed away.
In her isolation, she talks with her deceased husband and he answers her. Why did you write the story that way?
I don't think I ever really set out to write it that way, funnily enough. In fact, I wrote the first half of the book 3 times and kept having to delete it because I just never felt that I was quite capturing the story that I really wanted to write. And then I think it happened quite naturally that Tess was just so alone and so missed Mark that she started talking to him. And when that came actually from my own experience, when my husband was away once, I had a funny story to tell him, which I can't remember what it was now. And I think because when you know your partner very well, you sort of know what they might say back to you. I told him the story and then he made a joke in my head back to me when I laughed out loud. And it was a funny little thing that really triggered for me that you can still talk to people when you know them well enough, even if they're not there anymore. And I think that became part of Tess, really. Helped her a lot to talk to him still. Even though it was only herself answering back, she did know him well enough, I think, to know what he would say.
My husband would totally disagree with you. He gets angry when I tell him what he would say.
That is very true, I think. I mean, I get it wrong with my husband many times as well, I must say. But when he makes silly jokes, that's when I know he's going to do it. Got a very immature sense of humour.
Most men do.
Yeah. I think it really helped give the reader a sense of her relationship with Mark as well, to have that conversation between the two of them. Although it didn't make it that easy to write, actually, because the whole book was her talking to him, which meant I couldn't just walk someone around the house and describe everything that was in the house, because she was really talking to Mark. And he knew the house. So I had to be careful how I described things. I couldn't just go and describe how you would describe it in another book. It had to be her talking to Mark. So that did add a bit of a spanner in the works in some of the descriptions, but I hopefully worked through it.
I thought it was brilliantly done. I think it really helped move the story along and gave it another level.
And it was a good way to realize her background as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with a lot of times with books, dialogue takes up so much of the book, and I absolutely love dialogue. But because Tess spent so much time on her own, I really wanted to break up her thoughts with, even though it wasn't dialogue, with some sort of back and forth that really helped, like you say, move the story on. So I'm glad that came across.
It definitely did. You did an excellent job of creating a suspenseful and compelling book about psychosis and grief. Do you have background as far as grief counseling goes?
No, I don't. I did a lot of research into grief and sort of the steps that you can go through. And I have a background in psychology. I studied psychology for a number of years, which I think when I first set about writing this book, I knew I wanted to draw on that. But I would say that I think a lot of it just came from me putting myself in Tess's position and Shelley's position and trying to show really the two different sides of grief. Because Shelley was also experiencing grief in her own way, showing how you can experience it so differently, but still be so torn apart by the loss.
We've already talked a lot about how Tess was isolated, that she had moved from a large town to a small country village. How do you think her grief might have manifested differently had she still been among her close friends in Chelmsford?
That's such a good question. And I think about that a lot of the time. And I do go back and forth in my head, I think. I would like to think that Tess would have had such a huge support network in Chelmsford, where she used to live. She was on an estate with all her friends around. In my head, I think they'd have been popping in and out constantly. She would not have had the opportunity, I don't think, to have isolated herself in the same way that she did in the village. So that's one side. And then I also think sometimes, well, I think if you really want something bad enough, then you're going to find a way to get it. So I don't really know the answer, but I would hope that she would have coped better.
I do know from experience that if you want to experience grief, nothing's going to stop you from doing that, no matter how many people are around.
And that is so true. And the number of people around doesn't really mean that you're not going to feel isolated either. So I don't know really the answer, but I do think that it was a perfect storm in a way, where the house she lived in the village she lived in, and being so alone, I think that definitely contributed to her illness.
I would totally agree.
Yes.
Well, Lauren, this is your first book, correct?
Yes, it is my debut, yes.
We are so very impressed, and we can't wait to see what you come up with next. Are you working on anything?
Yes, I am working on a book. It hasn't got a title, I'm afraid, yet. We're still discussing that one, but I can give you a little bit about what's it about if you're interested.
Oh, definitely.
So it's about a female doctor who works in emergency medicine. She is pushed to the brink of a breakdown by an unknown stalker, and it's a book about what happens when she takes matters into her own hands, and it asks the question, if someone's been torturing your life and you have the chance to end theirs, would you do it, and could you do it? It's a very pacey, slightly and dark book again, I think, for me, but moving away from grief. A slightly different one.
Well, it sounds fascinating, and definitely send us a copy when that comes out.
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you. Yes, I certainly will.
Well, I have a question for you personally. Since you have moved from a big city to a small village, has that helped your writing?
It did, actually. I did used to write and tinker around in my early 20s, and I never really got anywhere. And then I had my two children very close together. They're only a year apart. And then obviously I didn't write anything for several years. And then we moved to the very small village where I didn't know anybody, and my children went to preschool, and I suddenly didn't have a single thing to do and no one to talk to. So I suggested to my husband that we had another baby, and he said, oh, no, I'm sure you want to do some writing again. So I opened up my laptop and started writing again. So that's how, yes, it certainly did help. And I live in such a beautiful part of England at the moment, and it's just very, very beautiful countryside. And I certainly feel that it does help my creativity to have peace around me.
Well, that's great. We are very happy that you did, because we really enjoyed this book, and we definitely look forward to your next.
Thank you. That is so kind. I thought your questions were incredibly insightful, so thank you very much.
Do you have a time frame for the untitled book?
I believe it's coming out in the fall next year, hopefully. So
okay.
Crossed for this time next year, hopefully.
All right. Lovely. Well, Lauren, thank you so much. Oh, first off, can you tell our listeners where they can find out more about you?
Yes, certainly. I am on social media. So I am on Twitter, which is at Lauren_C_North. And I'm on Facebook as Lauren North author. I also have my own website, which is www.lauren-north.com. So hopefully people can find me all about there. And I'll also be on the information on the website, Berkeley's website, which is my publisher. So yeah, with plenty of ways to get in touch. If anyone has read the book and would like to let me know what they think, I'm always interested to hear from people.
Okay, we'll put that